right, so we can just go ahead and get started. I'm going to give you a brief introduction, and then I'll pretty much let you go for a lot of this. So,
Sure. Yeah, and I've been doing a ton of these just for my TV job. I've been doing tons of interviews just on Zoom that have aired on television. So it's good to be on the other side.
Yeah, I bet. Well, don't judge me too harshly because I am not a professional like you are in asking the questions. So
all good.
Yeah. All right. So brief introduction here. Some of the people that I'm talking to that are going to hear this are going to need it. If you're from America, you may not know who Farhan Lalji is. If you're from Canada, you obviously know who he is. So my connection with Farhan is I saw him running a football camp years ago, the Big Kahuna passing tournament. As a young coach, I went to that as an assistant and was like, wow, this is really cool. And it was just done so well. And we've run a passing tournament for over a decade now at our place. And you were a big inspiration to that and how you did that. And it's been fun having you bring your teams from New Westminster crossing the border to come compete at our place. And boy, your job coaching there. Won a provincial championship a couple years ago, got them back then again the next year. And your success level has been awesome with that. The way you've invested in high school football and community football in British Columbia is something that I really have admired. I don't know if you know, I was born in Kamloops, lived on the reservation in Chase, got a shout out to my Shuswap family there until I was 5. Then I lived in Ladner and Tawasin and played youth football with the South Delta Rams for 5 years. And then I went to Linden Christian, moved down to Washington. But so what you've done for high school football in British Columbia, good on you. It's amazing what you've done. You've raised the bar there, serving as president of that association as well for a while. And then, you're a busy guy. You're the SportsCentre anchor for TSN. For our American listeners, that's ESPN in Canada. So thank you for giving us some of your time. Now, other than the introduction, what this topic really is race and what's going on in our world right now. Obviously, it's kind of blowing up what's going on in the United States here, but obviously this is a worldwide issue, racism, and so what I've been doing is reaching out to people I'm connected to, people of color or that have family members that are, and just I want to get information. So the philosophy is listen, learn, love, and lead. And so I just want to hear people's stories. And as those add up over a month of doing these interviews, I think it's really going to just change the way people hear things and hear it at a heart level. So if you can maybe give us some of your background and how racism has touched you personally.
Well, Dan, first of all, thanks for having me. It's awesome to be here. And I love coming to your tournament, even though we try to run the wing tee, and that never really goes well at a passing tournament. But and I'm actually going to take the year off from coaching this year, but I'm going to still stay involved in our board and try to be involved. My kid's a couple years away from getting into the football program, so he's in the 7th grade this fall. So I'm certainly looking forward to helping his youth team and getting back at coaching him in high school at some point down the road here. But I moved to Canada when I was 4. I moved from Africa. I was born in Tanzania, and I've got to be honest with you, I haven't experienced a ton of racism, and I say that because when you don't experience a ton of it, the few moments that you do experience really, really stick with you. And I can remember some moments that by today's standards would be categorized as very minor. Walking down the street one time and, my mother getting spit on by somebody and somebody saying something to my father at one point, in a parking lot. And again, I'm 52 now. So in terms of my entire life, I could probably count on 1 or 2 hands the amount of time that I personally have felt racism. But when you feel it, you remember it. And it doesn't mean that I haven't seen what's gone on to others. And it's really important. What this current time has shown us is that it's not about being sympathetic. It's about being empathetic. And I think that, for the longest time, it's been okay for leaders and football coaches and people to say, I'm not racist. That's enough. Right? I don't treat my players with a level of racism. That's enough. But it's kind of not enough anymore, right? Like, it's not okay to just not be racist, as they say. You've got to be anti-racist, and you've got to pick sides. And that's probably a good thing because people can't hide, and they've got to take the next step in their evolution. And one thing that I've learned, just kind of watching this process play out, is that as a football coach, we really glorify our game in terms of what it teaches. And we talk about the game teaching life lessons and values and teamwork and camaraderie and toughness, mental toughness, all of these other things. And sometimes as coaches, we lean on the game to teach those things. And I'm learning now that that's wrong. We have to teach those things. And the game might offer us a tool, but ultimately we have to teach it. So it's not, I think sometimes that football coaches, whether directly or indirectly, say to their players, regardless of race, color, or creed, come in and be a part of the family. And when you're in our bubble, all this stuff doesn't exist. We're all one. We're one family. That's not enough, because at some point, players have to leave the bubble, right? And if they're in the bubble for 3 hours a day or an 8-hour school day or whatever it happens to be, that's just not enough anymore. Those players will leave the bubble and they're going to go back to their real lives, whether it's on a given day, whether it's in the off season, whether it's when they graduate. They all have to go back to their bubble, and we have to kind of empathize and learn what that bubble looks and feels like and try to support them in that. And so we then have to step outside of our bubble. We have to make sure our programs step outside of their bubble, and then we can completely understand or attempt to understand what these people go through when they deal with racism on an everyday basis, and support them. You know, you hear more and more college players saying, support us like you do on Saturday. And that really matters, because when you look at what happens, you know, in the South, and where there's certainly more racism, and not that the Northwest is immune to it or that Canada is immune to it. There are, you know, when you look at what happens there, you know, the people that are the most racist are cheering the loudest on Saturdays, right? And that has to change, right? So, you know, I saw Tom Herman. You know, his post when all of this happened really resonated, that, yeah, you'll cheer them, but would you let your daughter date them? How would you feel about marrying them? Like, all of those things, like, we have to think a little deeper and take that next step as leaders to make sure we can truly make an impact. Wow.
Awesome. That's definitely powerful. And you know, I resonate with, you know, hey, we're one, we're family. And you know, I've said, hey, while we're here, this is our little sanctuary, right? You don't have to think about other things. But the lasting impact that we want to have in the lives of our athletes and our students has to reach beyond that bubble. That's awesome. So how about in your interactions professionally? You've had the opportunity to talk with so many different professional athletes and people of all different backgrounds. Have you seen things? So you've been blessed to not have to have dealt with it a lot personally, but what kind of things have you observed? And maybe from that, what kind of suggestions might you make?
Well, number one, you know, it's funny because when I say I haven't experienced a lot of it, there's times when you grow up where you are experiencing it, but you don't think you are, like in that moment, you know. And I remember just close friends of mine, like people who genuinely liked me, would use racial terms just because that's kind of how they were used to talking and what they were used to hearing. And then I would go to their homes and their parents would say those things. And then you'd kind of think, well, what chance did the kid have? Right? Like, of course he's going to talk like that because that's all he's heard. So I think, you know, how we message is really important. And I've talked to so many athletes over the years, and I actually hosted a racism roundtable with a number of CFL players, white and black, that lived in the United States, and some that have lived in Canada. And, you know, I've kind of tried to dig a little deeper in this topic over the last 3 months. And it's amazing the amount of, I think I've understood racism. I don't think I've really understood systemic racism until I've really tried to learn it in the last 3 months, why things are the way they are. And like in British Columbia, we don't have a lot of African American, we don't have a lot of black people here, right? Like I think it's 1.7% in terms of the ethnic breakdown. We have a lot of people of my color. We have a lot of Asians. And then where our systemic racism comes in is in First Nations people, right? Yeah. And so, you know, some of the things that you hear African-American athletes in the United States talk about in the systematic form of racism and how it's built into society and what our cultural norms are, you hear in the First Nations community, right? And you get to see kind of their direct impact. And, you know, it's just amazing in terms of things you take for granted in education. I'd never heard of Juneteenth until 2 years ago, right? And, you know, when you look at the cultural significance of a date like that, and I remember growing up listening to the, you know, stories about the Civil War, and it was always termed as states' rights. Well, states' rights is flat out racism, right? It's you know, systematically approved racism, and we're just calling it states' rights. And so when you hear how stories are framed. And when you talk about redlining in the United States and, how that leads to economic disparity, when you learn about how education is funded purely by property taxes, right? And so now you live in an affluent area, you're going to get more in the way of property taxes. You live in the ghetto where there's no property taxes because most of the homes aren't even owned. And what comes back the other way, you learn and where it comes from and potentially systems on how to fix it. You learn about policing in the United States. I think that's probably one of the biggest differences between the United States and Canada. And in Canada, there's, I can't sit here and say there's no racism. There is, but I do think it's a more significant thing when you talk to the athletes that come up here. They feel safe in Canada, right? If they could get paid nearly as much as they do in the NFL, they'd never want to go to the NFL because they feel they can lead a safe life here. And I think one of the reasons why it's different is policing is a little different here, because in the U.S., there's so many layers of policing that you don't have here. So you have, in the city, in counties, on campuses, like there's so many layers of policing. And because of that, there's just a need for so much policing. So you have people getting jobs that could never get a job that involves any level of power in any other walk of life. But now they get a job in policing, they have authority. The Second Amendment allows them to have guns along with their job, encouraging them to use guns. There's so many layers to it, which leads to the situation in the United States. So I think knowledge is power, and I think how you speak is power, right? And so, it's important for us to kind of be sensitive. I don't know about you, but I make my players wear a suit or a shirt and tie on game day. A lot of high school programs on both sides of the border do that. They believe that it shows professionalism in their players. But do we have to think about it differently now and say, does it perpetuate racial stereotypes and myths? What is my version of professionalism might not be a person of color's view of professionalism, because their view of what's cool or what's right or what's wrong, is different, right? So we have to think a little bit deeper in all of these things, how we communicate, how we message, because it matters now. Because what you and I believe is appropriate or professional might not be what the parent of somebody else believes as appropriate and professional. A big thing for me, honestly, is the N-word. I hate it.
Yeah.
And it's kind of my hill to die on in all of this. I'm not giving in on this one topic. And I've had people of color say, nope, you have to think about this differently because it's our word and we can take it back and we can empower it. I don't agree. Maybe I'm wrong. And I think I put a lot of thought into this. But I don't let my players listen to music that has F-bombs and N-bombs in it. You get one strike. If I hear it once, you lose music privileges for the season. And it's not up to me to have to, I don't want to have to explain to my son who's 10 or 11 walking into a locker room hearing these words why it's wrong, right? So we all have to kind of go through this at every level of our programs, how we talk, how we message, what we believe in, and what our hills to die on are, because in that process, we become more empathetic and just we can make our players think about things differently as well.
Yeah, I love hearing that. Those are go-tos for me as well. Players, we have music at practice, and they don't necessarily always love my playlist, but I have to listen. I need to hear all the lyrics, and there can't be any of that stuff in there. And there's going to be kids, 10-year-olds walking around at our practice, or so that's a big deal to me too.
I've had people on social media come at me and say, black music was created by black people for black people, and I'm like, no, it's not, because young people, regardless of color, think it's cool, right?
Yeah.
So, and certainly if you're an artist, you want to sell, right? And so you are catering to everybody. Yeah. So again, like that's just my thing. But maybe I look at clothing differently. Maybe I look at other types of language differently, and how to put things in context. We've all said things we regret. I'm sure if you go back at some point, I know I have, right? And it's unfortunate because right now, actually, I shouldn't say it's unfortunate. It's just reality that we're being judged in 2020 for what we may have said years ago, or what we learned years ago. It was acceptable then, it's not now. And some people are losing their jobs as a result of it. But if that day of reckoning is going to lead to equality, then it's probably worth it.
Yeah, the cancel culture is it is extreme. And like you, I think I'm thankful there wasn't social media when I was a teenager, right? Again, if there's some prices we have to pay and it leads to improvement and reducing significantly racism, then great. I think personally, I think it can get carried away, but if that's what it can lead to, then I'm all for it, like you said. Now you mentioned the First Nations. several years ago in Canada, they had the Truth and Reconciliation Project,
Mm-hmm.
largely around the residential schools. Have you seen improvements in people's awareness and maybe how they treat the First Nations and Aboriginal people there?
Yeah, I think so. I think my son's just peeking into the background.
Come on in.
Anyway, as I was saying, with First Nations, yeah, I think you're seeing a lot of that, right? I think there's a lot of education that's been put forward, and I think we're starting to recognize who's here first, right? You're seeing it in terms of tributes. You're seeing it in terms of messaging. Schools are being named after various leaders. You're learning about those people. I think one thing we've seen here for a lot of years is that there's been a lot of money and resources now put towards First Nations, people and First Nations causes, right? I mean, if you're a person that is First Nations here, you can basically get university education completely paid for. There's certainly, land areas, we call them First Nations. They used to be called reservations, that are set up. But, I think what's happening now, and this is coming and it's being driven largely by the First Nations community, is, hey, listen, it's not just all about throwing money at the problem. We've got to look at things a little bit differently in terms of, respect and acknowledgement and just how we want to kind of deal with that type of messaging. And, I do think it's getting better. I think it takes time because ultimately I think it takes generations. The Canadian Football League team up here, because of what's happening in the U.S., there's a team called the Eskimos. And, they're now having to re-examine their name. And for the past 3 years, they've been connected to the Indigenous community where they've tried to find out whether or not this name is a problem, whether or not it's offensive. And they've actually been quite engaged with those communities, but now they've got to re-engage this particular year because of what's happening now. They're also dealing with some corporate pressure. So it's happening on a lot of levels, right? And stereotypes take a long time. I mean, there are people in certain areas that are just going to, equate certain communities with poverty, alcoholism, crime. Like it takes time. We can sit here and punch people in the face and say, no, you have to think differently. But we have to show them what they're actually about and what they can mean and what the best of them really are, right? And to the point where eventually we stop thinking about it in terms of them and us and just kind of put it all together, right? But as you say, right, the pendulum is going to have to go all the way this way before it comes back to the middle, right? We were here, we're going to have to get there before we get here.
Yeah. Speaking of naming, your alma mater, Simon Fraser, big news breaking there with their mascot name, the Klansman, right? Scottish heritage, but there's been a lot of pressure by student groups to make a name change there. And I heard maybe some big news happen in the last day or two. You want to share about what happened there and what your thoughts are on that?
Well, they're going through an engagement process. So on Monday, I was part of a group of alumni. The previous week, there was about 150 players, different athletes, current athletes that were involved in a virtual town hall. And then earlier this morning, there was kind of some older alumni that were involved as well. They're going through a real meaningful engagement process. And by the end of this month, they're going to make a recommendation to the president, right, in terms of what they want to do. And, they hope that by the middle of August, there can be a recommendation on a name change, and potentially by the end of August, there will be. And it's been virtually unanimous. Yeah. Everybody, regardless of generation, believes this needs to change. And it's not because we believe the word clan or Klansman is offensive, but the players, the current athletes are having to deal with this. And it's not up to the players to have to educate, and it's not up to the players to have that burden. I mean, I remember I was sports information director at the school from 91 to 94. So in 93, I go to Jackson, Tennessee with the women's basketball team. They were ranked number 1 in the NAIA, and the national championships is there. And other than the schools in the West Tennessee area that were in the tournament, every fan there loved the Klan. And I'm trying to think about why. And then it kind of dawned on me that a whole bunch of white girls named the Klan in West Tennessee, and they loved the Klan, right? And at the time, when I did some interviews, I thought, they asked me, why is it spelled with a C? And I thought that was cute, but really it should have been kind of offensive, should it not? That they couldn't realize where it actually came from. They equated it to the Klan. They actually appreciated and approved of it, right? And this was some time ago, but again, in the 90s. So, the athletes have had to deal with it, and it's real for them because, and going through the process, I actually went back and researched the Klan, and the actual Klan name in 1865 when the Klan was founded was spelled with a C, and it was named after Scottish Gaelic families, right? So they went from there to eventually the KKK. I used the example on our alumni call. I said, do you believe the University of Oregon benefits by the number of uniforms they have? Do you think student athletes are actually going to make a decision on the next 4 to 5 years of their lives based on how cool the uniforms are? Well, I'll tell you something. The University of Oregon and Phil Knight believe yes, that it does happen. So if you believe something as trivial as uniform styles will influence decisions, don't think a name or a mascot won't influence decisions. So if it hurts recruiting, if it's something the players have to feel shame for, because we're the only Canadian school that plays in the United States. If we were in the Canadian university athletic system, it probably doesn't matter. But because we're in the States and those images are there, the word isn't wrong, but the images associated are. And it's been unbelievable to watch that, alumni that are in their 60s and 70s are supporting the students of today in this cause and saying it's time to change the name. So it's going to happen.
Yeah, awesome. And tradition is awesome. You want to hang on to tradition and protect the Scottish heritage. I think there's probably lots of ways you can honor that heritage with a different name. But if your current students, like you said, are not proud to wear the jersey, and you have to put Simon Fraser instead of the clan on it, that probably tells you something right there, right?
Yeah. Well, you're right. And, it kind of comes back to the cancel culture thing, because the naysayers have said you need to educate people. Well, no, we don't. Like, the athletes don't have to do that, right? But all that said, there are lines, in what I see in the United States. I mean, yeah, the Confederate flag needed to come down and it needed to change, but could you look at some of the people that we're trying to eliminate from history? Could you learn from them? Mm-hmm. And those are important questions to ask, because you can't just tear everything down, right? And it just depends on what your institution is. And there are some institutions like the U.S. military, for example, that shouldn't promote this on any level. Mm-hmm. But there are some places where you could potentially use some of these things to change, right? To say, okay, well, why are we studying this statue? Why is this building named after this person? We should be able to look at certain things, again, depending on the context and depending on who you are and what you're representing, right? Where it is appropriate to say, let's look at this, let's think about it deeper and learn from it, as opposed to just trying to eliminate it and pretend it didn't happen.
Yeah, I think that's a great way, personally, in my view. You can't change your history. A big part of what we're trying to do is enlighten people, like maybe there hasn't been enough learned about different minority groups' history. And so let's broaden that. But you can't change the negative things either. They need to be taught. I think it's probably appropriate not to be flying the Confederate flag from a state house now. But you probably need to have part of that history where it's in the museum. And if there's a statue there, well, let's talk about that, right?
Well, U.S. history, though, Dan, it's been so sanitized, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I said earlier about the Juneteenth and the states' rights. Like, that's one of the things I've really learned talking to people from the U.S., African Americans that are coming up here involved in the CFL, mm-hmm. is just what version of history they were taught, mm-hmm. right? And so I would hope that it really leads to a complete, accurate version, not a left-wing, not a right-wing version of history, but, an actual version of history that can meet somewhere in the middle that represents all sides equally. Because, if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it, right? We've said that before, so you can't eliminate it, right? We do want to learn from it.
Yeah, I had a parent of one of my former players who actually commented in on a video from a couple days ago. It was talking about something that happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921. There was a massacre that happened where white people in the area came in and they just murdered a whole community of African Americans. Mm-hmm. And he commented and said, I've always considered myself quite well versed on American history, and I knew nothing about it. I kind of feel ashamed. And so I totally agree. Let's put it all out there. Don't sanitize it. Let's put it out there and learn from the good and the bad. So let's go a couple more things, and then I'll let you go. I know you're a busy man, and I really appreciate your time. 2. One, is there a mentor that has impacted your life? And then the last one is, what gives you the most hope moving forward, particularly in the race issue?
Probably my biggest mentor was my old high school coach, and that's probably why I got into coaching, just because I wanted to continue to be influenced by him. And he wasn't like me, right? I mean, in my industry on the television side, you tend to be fairly out there and you tend to be fairly public and expressive. And he wasn't like that. I mean, he was really passionate. He was really prepared, but he just lived right. That was probably the biggest thing he did. He was just a good human being. And when you saw how he carried himself, how he presented himself, the type of husband and father he was, he didn't know he was influencing me. He didn't attempt to influence me. I think for me, I attempt to influence athletes, and I consciously know I'm doing that. I don't think he ever did that once. He just did it by who he was. And so I think he influenced me greatly, and I still stay in touch with him to this day. And, he comes to our games now, and his health is diminishing a little bit, right? And, the program that I played in, the school no longer has football, right? So I've always tried to tell him that our program is an extension of him, because without him, we wouldn't have done this, right? So, he means a lot to me, and he was probably my biggest mentor. Also, there was a lady by the name of Alison McNeil, who was the women's basketball coach at Simon Fraser, and she wound up becoming the head coach of the women's national team and coached at the Olympics. And, I remember covering the Olympics in 2012 in London, and she was there as the women's national team coach. So, we had a few moments about just how far the two of us had come from, the early 90s at Simon Fraser. But one thing she taught me was that you could be as demanding as possible and still love your athletes, right? And she had that, where she was so intense and fiery and would scream at these athletes at the top of her lungs in practice and in games, but then would cry with them in her office, right? And I just found that amazing, that she could just have both sides of it, and they would accept the harsh, demanding tone and criticism because they knew how much she cared, right? So those are probably the two that influenced me the most. And in terms of hope, all I can say is that, my son is way smarter than I was at 11 and 12, and he's been exposed to way more than I was at 11 and 12. And the kids that I'm around, when I speak and do leadership seminars on the coaching front, I hear all the time from coaches that, kids have changed, and they view that as a negative, right? That kids aren't the same anymore, and it's hard to coach them the same way anymore. And I have a slide that I put up, and I have a picture of Bear Bryant in the middle, and I have Ken Stabler and Joe Namath on either side of it. And I talk about how how Bear Bryant was probably more important than God in the state of Alabama in the 60s. And yet these two guys, they drank, they smoked, they caroused, they did all the things you would think an athlete from the 60s playing in the Alabama program, being coached by God, would never do, but they did it. But at the same time, they still revered Bear Bryant and eventually kind of came in and fell in line, right? And I think it's incumbent on us to speak the language of current athletes. They're so much farther ahead than we were at that age, and they're so much more socially and culturally aware. Unfortunately, social media is something that we can't control, and sometimes it can be a bit of a cesspool, but it can also be a great thing to help a movement and to educate if you kind of know how to use it correctly. So I think it's incumbent on us to speak their language, but I have faith in today's youth. I don't view it as the fact that they're different as being a negative. I think it's a positive, and we just have to kind of figure out what they like, speak their language, and I think if we can do that, we can help empower them to make it a better world, and then take the next generation further.
Awesome. Hey, Farhan, I appreciate you more than you know. I thank you for your time. I'm going to give you the last word. If there's any last comment that you want to make, I'll let you close us out.
Well, just thanks for doing this. I think it's great, because the more dialogue we have, the more it makes our game and our sport and coaching in general inclusive. I still believe that young people want to be led. They just want to believe in their leaders. And a guy like you, by doing something like this, is doing that, because you're allowing yourself to think differently. You're broadening your own perspectives. By me talking and listening to you, I'm doing the same. And I think this type of dialogue is really, really constructive.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right, my man. Look forward to seeing you again, maybe next year at the 7-on-7.
Let's do it.
All right.
Awesome.